In the dark days of World War II, Nazi Germany's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to promote one central idea: the supposed superiority of the Aryan race. Adolf Hitler believed his Luftwaffe, Germany's powerful air force, was the ultimate proof of that ideology. His fighter aces were meant to symbolize German precision, courage, and dominance in the skies. But in 1944, that illusion was shattered by an unlikely group of aviators: the Tuskegee Airmen, a unit of African-American pilots who would not only outfly the Luftwaffe, but also humiliate the Nazi racial myth at its core. The story begins in Tuskegee, Alabama, where the United States Army Air Corps reluctantly opened a segregated flight training program in 1941. Many military officials, including some high-ranking generals, believed African Americans lacked the intelligence and courage needed for aviation. But under pressure from civil rights activists and the Roosevelt administration, the program went forward. Out of it emerged the 332nd Fighter Group and the 99th Fighter Squadron, known collectively as the Tuskegee Airmen. They trained in isolation, faced racism at every step, and were given inferior equipment. Yet their determination was unmatched. Many of these young men came from families that had endured generations of discrimination, but they were determined to prove themselves, both for their country and for their people. As one pilot later put it, "We weren't just fighting the Germans. We were fighting prejudice, too." By early 1944, the Tuskegee Airmen were flying combat missions over Italy, escorting American bombers into enemy territory. Their signature aircraft, the red-tailed P-51 Mustang, soon became a symbol of excellence and reliability. Bomber crews began to request red-tail escorts because of their incredible discipline and low loss rates. Unlike other fighter groups that sometimes abandoned bombers to chase enemy kills, the Tuskegee Airmen held formation and protected their charges to the very end. Their professionalism caught the attention of both Allied and Axis commanders. The Luftwaffe, which once ruled the skies of Europe, was beginning to falter under the strain of relentless Allied bombing. When Hitler was informed that an all-black unit of American pilots had repeatedly outmaneuvered and outflown his seasoned fighter aces, he was reportedly furious. Nazi ideology had no room for such a reality. His entire regime was built on the belief that non-Aryans were inferior, incapable of matching German skill or intellect. Yet, here were black pilots, men he considered subhuman, destroying that illusion in full view of the world. German intelligence quickly took notice. Reports began to circulate within the Luftwaffe about the Schwarze Teufel, the Black Devils, who flew the red-tailed fighters. These pilots were disciplined, precise, and deadly accurate. In engagements over the Balkans and Germany, the Tuskegee Airmen shot down some of the Luftwaffe's best pilots, including members of elite squadrons. The psychological impact was immense. If Hitler's master race could be bested by the very people his ideology sought to demean, what did that say about his so-called superiority? Hitler's reaction was, as always, a mixture of rage and denial. According to Allied intelligence reports after the war, Nazi propaganda outlets were instructed to downplay any encounters with black pilots. German radio and newspapers avoided mentioning them altogether, even when Luftwaffe losses were severe. The Nazi leadership feared that public acknowledgement of the Tuskegee Airmen's success would undermine the racial myths at the heart of the regime. The silence, however, could not hide the truth from those on the front lines. Among Allied airmen, word spread quickly. The Red Tails had become legends. Bomber crews who had once doubted them now swore by their protection. Their record spoke for itself. Over 15,000 sorties flown, more than 100 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, and an exceptional reputation for bomber escort missions. General Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., their commander, maintained strict discipline and professionalism, proving that the color of one's skin had nothing to do with courage or skill. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, continued to crumble. By the end of 1944, Hitler's Air Force was a shadow of its former self. Its resources were drained, its pilots were young and inexperienced, and its once terrifying reputation had faded. The Tuskegee Airmen were one of many factors contributing to that decline, but their symbolic victory over Nazi ideology was one of the most powerful blows of all. The irony was profound. At home, these same pilots still faced racism, segregation, and exclusion from white officers' clubs. In the skies over Europe, they had proven themselves equals or superiors to any pilot alive. Yet, when they returned to the United States, they were still treated as second-class citizens. Hitler's fury at their success was one thing. The quiet indifference of their own country was another. It would take years before their contributions were properly recognized. After the war, their legacy began to grow. President Harry S. Truman's 1948 Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces, was influenced in part by the Tuskegee Airmen's exemplary record. Historians later called their achievements a double victory. Victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism. As for Hitler, his belief in racial superiority did not survive the war. The very existence of the Tuskegee Airmen stood as living proof that courage, discipline, and excellence know no color. Nazi ideology collapsed not only under the weight of military defeat, but also under the moral contradictions it could no longer conceal. The skies over Europe had been a proving ground, and in those battles, black pilots from Alabama helped destroy one of history's most poisonous myths. Today, the Tuskegee Airmen are remembered not only as war heroes, but as pioneers who transformed both military and social history. Their story is a reminder that even in the darkest times, truth can cut through propaganda, and dignity can triumph over hatred. What Hitler did when he found out they had outflown his Luftwaffe, rage, denial, and silence, was telling. He could suppress reports, twist propaganda, and try to erase their names. But he could not change the fact that his Luftwaffe had been beaten by the very people he despised. And in that, perhaps, lies the greatest irony of all. The skies that Hitler once claimed for his master race became the stage where his greatest lie was exposed, for the world, and for history to see. When the war finally ended in 1945, Europe lay in ruins. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's war machine, had been reduced to fragments. Allied air power dominated the skies, and among the countless squadrons that had contributed to that victory, one group stood apart: the Tuskegee Airmen. Their story had become more than a tale of military excellence. It was a direct challenge to centuries of prejudice, not only in Nazi Germany but within the very ranks of the Allied nations themselves. After Germany's surrender, Allied forces captured vast troves of Nazi records, propaganda materials, and intelligence reports. Historians studying them in the years that followed found clear evidence of how deeply Nazi ideology had been shaken by encounters with the Tuskegee Airmen. Reports from Luftwaffe officers described the red-tailed American fighters as unusually disciplined and impossible to bait. They noted, almost with disbelief, that these squadrons showed none of the recklessness often seen among younger Allied pilots. The Nazis had expected chaos. Instead, they met precision. Hitler's reaction to such reports was predictably explosive. Witnesses from his inner circle recalled his rants about American decadence and racial contamination. He could not publicly admit that his Aryan airmen had been bested by men he deemed racially inferior. In Nazi propaganda, the encounters were buried or attributed to mechanical failures or numerical disadvantages. But the truth had already taken flight, literally, across Europe. For Allied troops, especially African American soldiers stationed in Europe, news of the Tuskegee Airmen's victories became a symbol of pride and proof of equality. When we heard about them, we walked taller, one black infantryman later recalled. They were our heroes in the sky, proof that Hitler's lies were just that, lies. However, when the Tuskegee Airmen returned to the United States, they were met not with parades but with segregation signs. Many were denied access to officers' clubs, restaurants, and even basic housing on bases they had helped defend. The cruel irony was unmistakable. They had fought to defeat a racist empire abroad. only to return to a country still mired in its own racial hierarchy. Captain Roscoe Brown, one of the Red Tail pilots, later said, "We had proven that given the opportunity, we could compete and win." The question was, would America recognize that? For years, the answer was, not yet. The post-war period was filled with contradictions. The Tuskegee Airmen's record was impeccable. They had destroyed over 250 enemy aircraft, earned hundreds of medals, and achieved one of the lowest bomber loss rates in the European theater. Yet their achievements were largely ignored in official military histories for decades. Some white officers even attempted to claim credit for their escort success. But the truth could not be buried forever. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. Historians have since pointed out that the Tuskegee Airmen's combat record played a crucial role in his decision. Truman, a former artillery officer in World War I, was deeply moved by their professionalism and saw their treatment as a national disgrace. Desegregation in the military was not instantaneous. Resistance was strong. But the airmen's legacy had started a chain reaction. They had forced the U.S. government to confront its hypocrisy. If black pilots could escort bombers through flak and fire over Germany, there was no moral justification for denying them equal status at home. The skies they had conquered abroad now became a metaphor for the freedoms they demanded on American soil. The Tuskegee Airmen's impact stretched beyond the United States. Across the decolonizing world, in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia, their story circulated through newspapers and word of mouth. For people fighting against colonial rule, the image of black men defeating Nazi Germany in the air was electrifying. It symbolized a new era where old hierarchies could be challenged and where the color of one's skin no longer dictated destiny. In post-war Germany itself, their existence took on another kind of meaning. German civilians who had lived under Nazi propaganda were stunned to see photographs of the airmen after the war, smiling, decorated, and victorious. They shattered the caricatures Nazi ideology had painted. To many Germans rebuilding their lives, it was one of the first hints that the world they had been taught to believe in had been a dangerous illusion. By the time Hitler took his own life in April 1945, the racial myth he had built his empire on was already collapsing. The Tuskegee Airmen had been a small part of that downfall, but a symbolically devastating one. His vision of Aryan supremacy had depended on the idea that certain races were biologically incapable of excellence. The Red Tails proved that excellence had nothing to do with race and everything to do with discipline, opportunity, and courage. One former Luftwaffe pilot, interviewed after the war, reportedly admitted, "We feared the Red Tails. They flew with purpose. You could tell they were fighting for something, more than just victory." That something more was dignity, and it terrified Hitler. More than any weapon, it took decades for the Tuskegee Airmen to receive full recognition. In 2007, more than 60 years after their wartime service, surviving members were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal by President George W. Bush. The ceremony was emotional and long overdue. "You helped change the course of our military, and therefore the course of our nation," Bush said. "For all your achievements and for all your courage, we honor you." Since then, their story has entered school curriculums, documentaries, and films. But beyond the medals and ceremonies lies a deeper truth. Their triumph in the skies over Nazi Germany was not just a military success, it was a moral one. It dismantled lies that had stood for centuries and proved that equality is not granted. It is earned, fought for, and defended. Today, the red-tailed P-51 Mustang stands as one of the most recognizable symbols of courage in aviation history. It represents a moment when history turned on its head, when those deemed least likely to succeed became the very ones who shattered an empire's illusion. If Hitler could have seen the legacy that followed, black astronauts piloting space shuttles, black generals leading air commands, and young cadets at the U.S. Air Force Academy tracing their lineage back to Tuskegee, he would have understood the full depth of his defeat. The sky, Once a realm he claimed for his master race became a testament to humanity's shared potential. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't just outfly the Luftwaffe. They outflew hate itself. The guns of World War II had fallen silent, but for the men who wore the crimson tails of the Tuskegee Airmen, a new kind of battle was only beginning. They had fought Hitler's Luftwaffe in the skies over Europe, and won. Yet, when they returned home, they found themselves back in a nation that still saw their color before their courage. Their wartime triumph had proven a point on the global stage, but in the United States of the 1940s and 1950s, segregation was still the law of the land. The contradiction was staggering. These heroes had risked their lives to defend freedom, but couldn't sit at a lunch counter, vote without intimidation, or enter many of the same schools they'd helped protect. For the Tuskegee Airmen, the mission wasn't over. During the war, African-American newspapers had coined the phrase Double V, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. For the Tuskegee Airmen, that slogan became personal. They had already achieved the first V in combat, but the second would take years of patience, persistence, and sacrifice. Many of the airmen became advocates for equality after the war. Their discipline, leadership, and quiet dignity made them natural symbols for a rising generation of civil rights activists. In 1946, just 1 year after returning home, a Tuskegee veteran named Litt Coleman Young became a fierce voice for racial justice. He later entered politics and went on to become the first black mayor of Detroit, a living testament to how the skills and confidence honed in war could be turned into power and peace. Others continued serving in the military, determined to prove that integration was both possible and necessary. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had led the Tuskegee Airmen with an iron sense of professionalism, became the first black general in the U.S. Air Force. His promotion sent shockwaves through a military establishment that had resisted change for decades. Davis had endured racism even at West Point, where white cadets refused to speak to him for 4 years. He graduated in the top fifth of his class, and later commanded one of the most successful fighter groups in the war. Davis carried those lessons into the post-war years. When President Truman's Executive Order 9981 began desegregating the armed forces in 1948, it was Davis and other Tuskegee veterans who helped implement the new policy. They understood firsthand the cultural resistance inside the ranks, and how to dismantle it. Even as the Air Force integrated, the transition was far from smooth. Many Tuskegee Airmen faced subtle sabotage, promotions delayed, assignments denied, credit withheld. Yet they persisted. The same discipline that had helped them outfly Hitler's Luftwaffe now helped them navigate America's institutional barriers. One airman, Lieutenant Cole Charles McGee, flew over 400 combat missions across 3 wars: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. When asked years later how he survived the racism of his time, he answered simply, "Excellence is the best deterrent to discrimination." That philosophy became the unspoken creed of the Tuskegee Airmen. They would win, not through anger, but through excellence so undeniable it forced the system to change around them. Their professionalism also reshaped how America saw its own image. At the height of the Cold War, when the United States claimed to be the world's champion of freedom, segregation had become an international embarrassment. Soviet propaganda regularly highlighted America's racial hypocrisy. The heroism of the Tuskegee Airmen gave U.S. leaders an example to point to, proof that the country could live up to its democratic ideals. In the 1950s, as the civil rights movement gathered strength, many leaders looked to the Tuskegee Airmen as evidence of what equality could achieve. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who was in college when the airmen returned from war, often cited black servicemen's sacrifices in his speeches. He reminded America that those who bled for freedom overseas deserved it at home. In Montgomery, Alabama, not far from Tuskegee, the famous bus boycott began in 1955. Rosa Parks' quiet defiance was the spark, but the fire had been smoldering for years. Many local veterans, including Tuskegee Airmen, organized transportation networks, and offered logistical support. Their military experience, planning, discipline, coordination became vital tools in the nonviolent struggle for equality. By the 1960s, the influence of the airmen's example had spread across the movement. They had proven something fundamental, that dignity and courage were not granted by society but asserted by individuals. Every time a young activist faced down a mob or sat at a whites-only counter, they carried the same spirit that had once guided the Red Tails through German flak. While the civil rights movement transformed America's streets, the U.S. military quietly became one of the most integrated institutions in the country, thanks in large part to the Tuskegee legacy. By the late 1970s, African Americans were serving in senior positions across all branches. Pilots who had grown up idolizing the Red Tails began flying cutting-edge jets, commanding squadrons, and shaping policy. In 1995, General Daniel "Chappie" James, Jr., another Tuskegee veteran, became the first black four-star general in U.S. history. When asked what drove him, he answered, "The Red Tails taught me that the sky has no color." That simple truth rippled through generations. By the 21st century, black pilots were flying F-22 Raptors, commanding aircraft carriers, and even leading NASA missions. Every one of them stood on the shoulders of those who had once been told they couldn't fly at all. In 2009, the world watched as Barack Obama, a black man, took the oath of office as President of the United States. Among the honored guests seated near the front were several elderly Tuskegee Airmen in red jackets and caps. Their eyes glistened as Obama turned to acknowledge them during his inauguration speech. "Because of your example," he said, "we are here today." It was a moment of poetic symmetry. The men who had shattered Hitler's vision of racial supremacy now watched a man of color lead the very nation they had once been excluded from serving equally. Their fight in the skies had become a foundation for every step that followed on the ground. Today, the Tuskegee Airmen's story is taught not just in military academies but in schools around the world. Their example continues to inspire those who face barriers of prejudice, doubt, or fear. The Red Tails painted on their P-51 Mustangs are more than decoration. They are a symbol of defiance, perseverance, and hope. In 2020, when the U.S. Space Force inducted its first class of cadets, several speakers invoked the Tuskegee Airmen as the ultimate pioneers. One said they didn't just break the color barrier. They broke the sound barrier of hate. The skies they once fought to claim have now expanded to the stars. And every rocket, every mission, every new frontier carries a whisper of the same truth. Courage knows no color. The Tuskegee Airmen may have begun as a segregated experiment, but they ended as a universal symbol, not only of what it means to be American, but what it means to be human. When Hitler learned that black pilots had outflown his Luftwaffe, he raged in disbelief. But history had already moved on. Those pilots didn't just defeat an enemy in the air, they defeated an idea, and their victory, in the end, was for all of us. By the dawn of the 21st century, the roar of the P-51 Mustang had long faded from the skies. The Red Tails were no longer chasing Messerschmitts or weaving through flak clouds over Europe. Yet the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen continued to soar, higher, farther, and deeper into every corner of modern life. What began as a wartime experiment in 1941 had transformed into a global symbol of courage, excellence, and the boundless potential of the human spirit. In 1961, as the United States entered the space age, one of the first astronauts to set foot in NASA's new training program was Ed Dwight, a young African-American Air Force pilot. Though he never made it to space, Dwight was inspired by the Tuskegee Airmen, men who had paved the way for black aviators to even dream of the stars. "If they could outfly Hitler's Luftwaffe," Dwight once said, "then the sky was never the limit for us." Decades later, that dream would be realized. In 1983, Guion Guy Bluford, a decorated Air Force officer, became the first black American in space. A generation later, Colonel Charles Bolden, another pilot influenced by the Tuskegee legacy, became NASA's first black administrator. Bolden often credited the Tuskegee Airmen for breaking the barriers that made his own achievements possible. The airmen's influence had crossed from warplanes to spacecraft, from Alabama's red soil to the vast blackness of space. Their message was timeless. Excellence and courage can defy gravity, both physical and social. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen might have faded into history books if not for a wave of renewed interest beginning in the 1970s. Civil rights activists, educators, and filmmakers began to rediscover their story, a story that had been sidelined for decades by mainstream narratives of World War II. In 1995, HBO released The Tuskegee Airmen, starring Lawrence Fishburne as Hannibal Lee, a character based on several real pilots. For many Americans, it was the first time they had heard of these men who had fought racism and fascism at the same time. The film sparked a cultural awakening. Schools began to teach their story, museums curated exhibits, and surviving airmen were invited to speak across the country. More recently, George Lucas's 2012 film Red Tails brought their saga to a new generation, combining Hollywood spectacle with historical truth. While dramatized, it captured the spirit of the Red Tails, their frustration, bravery, and brotherhood. Lucas himself said he spent decades trying to make the film because the Tuskegee Airmen are the greatest heroes of the 20th century that no one ever told kids about. Their rediscovery wasn't just cinematic, it was redemptive. It gave a new face to heroism, one that wasn't whitewashed or idealized, but deeply human. In the early 2000s, time began to take its toll. Many of the original airmen were well into their 80s and 90s, but as their numbers dwindled, their recognition grew. In 2007, President George W. Bush awarded the surviving Tuskegee Airmen the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States. The ceremony, held in the Capitol Rotunda, was a moment of long-delayed justice. Hundreds of elderly men, once rejected by their own military, now stood as national heroes. Bush addressed them directly. "You helped win a war, and you helped change our nation for the better. You fought for freedom abroad, and you made America more free at home." The airmen's eyes filled with tears. Many had buried comrades who never lived to see that day. Yet, even in their humility, they saw that the struggle had been worth it. In the years that followed, the honors continued. Airfields, schools, and scholarships were named after them. In 2021, the U.S. Air Force created the Tuskegee Airmen Global Academy in Atlanta, designed to inspire the next generation of pilots, engineers, and leaders. Their red-tailed legacy had become a symbol of possibility for young people of all backgrounds. Beyond awards, the airmen's legacy endures in the ethos of modern leadership. Military academies today teach their story as a case study in perseverance under pressure. Corporate diversity programs invoke their name as proof that talent blooms when prejudice is stripped away. General Charles Q. Brown, Jr., who became the first black chief of staff of the U.S. Air Force in 2020, often spoke about their influence. "I stand on their shoulders," he said. "Every time I walk into a room in uniform, I remember that someone else had to fight just to wear this same uniform with pride." Brown's historic appointment, along with General Lloyd Austin's role as the first black U.S. Secretary of Defense, represents a full-circle moment. The highest ranks of American defense, once closed to men like the Tuskegee Airmen, are now occupied by those who carry their legacy forward. The Tuskegee Airmen's impact didn't stop at America's borders. Their courage became a touchstone for anti-colonial movements and independence struggles across Africa and the Caribbean. In Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria, young pilots training in newly independent air forces were taught about the Red Tails, not as Americans, but as symbols of African excellence and self-determination. In South Africa, during the final years of apartheid, activists invoked the Tuskegee Airmen as examples of how discipline and unity could overcome systems of oppression. Even today, black pilots around the world trace their inspiration back to those men who dared to fly when the world told them they couldn't. Their example reached even the former enemy. In Germany, Luftwaffe museums and military historians now teach the story of the Tuskegee Airmen as a lesson in humility, a reminder of how ideology can blind even the most advanced society to truth and justice. The last surviving airmen pass away. Their legacy takes on the quality of legend, not myth, but moral truth. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. That patriotism is not blind loyalty, but the willingness to make one's nation live up to its ideals. Their story endures because it speaks to something universal. They were men who refused to be defined by hate, who turned every insult into motivation, and who proved that excellence could be a weapon against injustice. In doing so, they didn't just change aviation, they changed history. One inscription at the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site reads, "They rose above expectations. They rose above fear. They rose above hate." That inscription could just as easily describe the human spirit itself. In 2020, NASA named its newest supply ship to the International Space Station the SS, Robert H. Lawrence, honoring the first black astronaut, himself inspired by the Tuskegee legacy. When it launched into orbit, the mission patch featured a red-tailed plane soaring toward the stars. It was more than a tribute. It was a continuation. The same spirit that had lifted those young men into the clouds over Italy now propelled humanity into space. As one historian put it, the Tuskegee Airmen didn't just prove that black men could fly, they proved that humanity could rise. Adolf Hitler once believed the skies belonged to his Aryan Empire. But history had other plans. The skies belonged to anyone brave enough to rise above ignorance. The Tuskegee Airmen outflew the Luftwaffe. They outlasted segregation, and in the end they outshone hate itself. Their flight path stretched from Alabama to Berlin, from war to peace, from division to unity. Every time a plane cuts across the blue horizon, somewhere in its shadow flies the legacy of those men, the pilots who turned prejudice into progress and made the impossible routine. The red tails may have faded, but their message endures. The sky is vast and it belongs to everyone.